Okay, so have you ever noticed how often we turn to metaphors when we try to describe ourselves?
Like, what do you mean?
Like, saying things like, ugh, my inner critic is so loud today, or I'm such a hopeless romantic.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's like we instinctively use these archetypes to understand who we are. What about you? Is there a particular archetype you find yourself relating to?
It's funny you should mention that. What always gets me is how much these metaphors resonate even when we don't consciously choose them.
It's like we're tapping into something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly, like a shared understanding of what it means to be human.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're about to explore something called a holographic archetype.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What exactly is a holographic archetype?
Think of it like a personalized energetic blueprint that shapes how we experience the world.
So it's like a unique map of our inner world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we get too far into it, I want to emphasize that this is just one perspective, one person's take on this.
So we're not talking hard science here.
Right. It's more like a different lens for looking inward, for understanding ourselves in a new light.
Gotcha. I'm all about exploring new perspectives. So how does this holographic archetype thing work?
Well, our source material uses this really interesting metaphor, a prism of light.
Okay, a prism of light. That sounds kind of out there, even for me.
I know, right? I thought the same thing at first.
So how does a prism of light relate to all of this?
It's all about understanding the multidimensional nature of who we are.
Okay, now you've got me really curious.
So imagine this prism with a vertical axis and a horizontal axis.
All right, I'm picturing it. A prism with a vertical and a horizontal axis. Go on.
Now, the vertical axis represents our connection to, the divine, to our purest potential, that gut feeling we call intuition.
So the vertical axis is like that inner voice, the one that urges us to go for our dreams even when it's scary.
Exactly. It's about connecting to something larger than ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the horizontal axis? Where does that fit in?
The horizontal axis is where things get more personal.
Personal how?
It reflects our everyday patterns, those things we do without even thinking about them. Our habits, reactions, you name it.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So, like, if I always crave chocolate chip cookies at 3 p.m., that's my horizontal axis, right?
Exactly.
And it's probably tied to something from my childhood, some unconscious association I've formed over the years.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how our past experiences imprint themselves on us.
Absolutely. So we've got this interplay between the universal, the vertical axis, and the personal, the horizontal axis. But where does self-awareness come into play?
That's the key to unlocking the power of this whole model.
Yeah.
The more aware we are of these patterns, the less we're just operating on autopilot.
So the vertical axis, that connection to something bigger than ourselves, helps us zoom out, see beyond our limited perspective.
Exactly. And the horizontal axis, that's where we can get stuck if we aren't paying attention.
But it's also where we can heal and create lasting change. That's pretty powerful when you think about it.
It is. But this brings up a question that I've been wrestling with. What about our shadow selves? Those parts of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge.
Oh, that's a good one. I've wondered about that too. Does that mean there are bad archetypes?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, where do those fit in with this whole prism idea?
Well, I don't think it's about labeling archetypes as good or bad.
Okay.
It's more like every archetype has two sides.
Two sides.
Yeah, a light side and a shadow side.
Oh, I see.
Like a coin, you can't have heads without tails.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's not about trying to get rid of our shadow selves altogether.
So we're not trying to banish them or anything?
No, not at all.
Okay, good to know.
It's more about understanding how both sides show up in our lives.
So how does that actually work? Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's take the archetype of the caregiver.
Okay, the caregiver.
The light side of the caregiver is all about compassion and empathy.
Yeah, wanting to nurture others.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
But then there's the shadow side.
Which looks like...
Think codependency, people-pleasing, neglecting your own needs.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Because you're so busy taking care of everyone else.
It's so easy to fall into that trap.
It is. It really is.
And it's something I think a lot of people can relate to.
Absolutely. We've all been there.
So if you find yourself stuck in that shadow side, how do you even start to shift things?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And this is where self-awareness is so crucial.
Okay, so how do we become more aware of those shadow patterns?
It starts with recognizing them.
Easier said than done,
Yeah.
right?
It can be, but it's not about beating yourself up for having those shadowy aspects.
Okay, that's good to hear.
It's about understanding where they come from and how they might be holding you back.
So it's about shining a light on those hidden parts of ourselves.
Exactly.
The parts we often try to keep in the dark.
Yes, bringing them into the light of awareness is the first step.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together.
All connected.
But I have to admit, this whole soul contract concept still feels a little out there for me, even with all of this.
I get it. It's a big concept.
It is.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
Imagine your soul contract as a pre-birth agreement you made with yourself.
We're talking about something we agreed to before we were even born.
In a sense, yes.
Okay, now you've really lost me.
I know it sounds strange, but stay with me.
All right, I'm listening.
This isn't about a literal contract signing or anything like that.
Okay, good.
It's more about the idea that our souls choose certain paths to help us evolve.
So we're choosing our challenges and lessons before we even come into this life.
That's the idea.
Okay, I think I kind of get it.
It's about understanding that there's a deeper purpose to our experiences.
Even the tough ones.
Especially the tough ones.
So how does this soul contract connect to the archetypes we've been talking about?
Well, the idea is that we often get stuck playing out the shadow side of certain archetypes because they're connected to those unresolved lessons we're here to learn.
So it's like those shadow archetypes are pointing us towards the work we need to do.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
It's like our soul is trying to get our attention, saying, hey, pay attention to this pattern.
So for example, someone who always seems to end up in the role of the victim.
Yes.
They might be working through some past trauma or a pattern they're meant to heal from.
Precisely.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
And the empowering part of all of this is that it's not about blame.
Okay, good.
It's about recognizing the pattern and choosing to rewrite the script.
So it's not about being a victim to our pasts or our archetypes.
Not at all.
We have the power to choose something different.
Exactly. You have agency.
That's a good reminder.
It's about stepping into a more empowered way of being.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we start rewriting those contracts and shifting those archetypes? I want the step-by-step guide.
Well, it starts with understanding how those negative beliefs take root in the first place.
Okay, how do they?
This source material outlines 5 stages of self-esteem and shame induction.
5 stages. Okay, break those down for me.
It all starts with externally induced messaging.
So messages we receive from the outside world.
Exactly. Think back to childhood.
Cool.
What were some of the messages you received about yourself?
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
From our families, from society, even from the media.
It's all around us, isn't it?
It is, and it starts early on.
So we're not born with these negative beliefs. We learn them.
Precisely.
And then what happens?
That brings us to the second stage.
Okay, what's stage 2?
Internalization.
Internalization.
With enough repetition, we start to believe those external messages as truth.
We take them on as our own.
Exactly.
Even if they're not true.
Even if they're not true.
Wow, that's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is. It's how those negative beliefs become so ingrained.
And so hard to shake.
Exactly.
So we've got the external messages, then we internalize them.
Right.
What's the next stage?
Stage 3 is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
But this is when those internalized messages become autonomous.
Autonomous.
Meaning they no longer need that external trigger.
They just start running on autopilot.
Precisely.
So even without someone telling us we're not good enough, we start to believe it on our own.
I know, it's kind of disheartening.
It is. It feels like we're fighting against ourselves.
In a way, we are.
So we're swimming in a sea of negative messages.
And eventually, we start to drown.
Which leads us to the 4th stage.
Yes.
Which is...
This identification.
We identify with that negative feeling.
Yes, it becomes a core part of how we see ourselves.
So we fully embody that archetype.
Exactly. Whether it's the victim, the saboteur, or whichever negative pattern has taken hold.
And that brings us to the final stage.
The 5th stage is the spiral.
The spiral. What's that?
This is where even the smallest trigger can bring back that whole web of negative beliefs.
It's like a shame spiral.
Exactly.
We get caught in this loop of our own making.
And it can feel impossible to break free.
So how do we escape the spiral?
That's what we're here to explore.
Because I think a lot of us feel trapped in those spirals.
That's a common human experience.
So where do we go from here? How do we break free and step into a more empowered version of ourselves? Okay, so where do we even begin? How do we unravel these deep-seated patterns and actually start creating a new story for ourselves?
That's the real journey, isn't it? It's about understanding that inner prism of light, especially how it connects to our energetic body.
When you say energetic body, are we talking about chakras?
Exactly.
Okay, I love that we're bringing chakras into this. But for those who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of what chakras are and how they fit into all of this?
Absolutely. Think of your chakras as these vibrant energy centers within your body.
Okay.
Each chakra is associated with different emotional and spiritual qualities that influence everything from how grounded we feel to our creativity, relationships, and even our intuition.
So how do these chakras connect to the archetypes and the soul contracts we've been discussing?
Well, this source material suggests that there's actually a link between specific archetypes and particular chakras.
Oh, really? Like what? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so let's say you often find yourself stuck in that victim archetype we were talking about earlier. That might suggest an imbalance in your solar plexus chakra, which is the energy center that governs things like personal power and self-esteem.
Fascinating. So by working on balancing that chakra, you could potentially shift out of that victim archetype.
Exactly.
It's like giving our energetic system a tune-up.
I love that analogy. And the best part is there are so many different ways to work with our chakras, from meditation to energy healing to yoga, even aromatherapy.
So many options.
It's about finding what feels right for you.
It's about tuning in and finding what resonates with your own unique energy. It's making me think about all the different roles I find myself stepping into. The friend, the partner, the creative, and yeah, sometimes even the stress case. It's like we're constantly cycling through all these different archetypes without even realizing it.
And that's the beauty of this work, becoming aware of those patterns so that we can start making more conscious choices about how we show up in the world.
So it's not about achieving some perfect, unchanging state of being. It's about embracing the fluidity, the constant evolution.
Exactly. And maybe even learning to laugh at ourselves along the way, right? Because none of us have it all figured out perfectly.
That is such an important reminder. So for anyone listening who might be feeling a little overwhelmed, just start by paying attention. What roles do you habitually play in your own life? What patterns keep showing up?
Yes. And maybe even ask yourself this. What if those negative traits we try so hard to hide are actually clues to our unmet needs?
It's like that saying, the things that bother us about others are often reflections of ourselves.
Precisely.
So instead of judging those parts of ourselves, we can approach them with curiosity and compassion, asking, what are you trying to teach me? What do you need?
Exactly. It's about befriending all parts of ourselves, even the messy ones.
Because within those parts often lies incredible wisdom and insight.
Beautifully said.
This has been such a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive today. It's given me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Me too.
But before we wrap up, I have one final question for you and for everyone listening. If you could rewrite your soul contract today, what would your ideal archetype be?
Ooh, that's a good one.
What would it take to step more fully into that version of yourself? It's something to ponder, isn't it?
Definitely.
And on that note, we'll leave you to explore those depths. Until next time, keep diving deep, and remember, your soul's blueprint is yours to create.